Paul Atreides, Padishah Emperor of the known universe, Kwisatz Haderach, Prophet, immortalized amongst the people not as his true name, but as Muad'Dib, the jumping mouse of the desert. Why? When the black arm of superstition of the Bene Desert laid its hands upon the planet of Arrakis, they instilled upon the Fremen the myth of Mahdi, the one who would lead them to paradise and deliver them from the endless sands, the Lisan al-Gaib, the Messiah. The witches used their black arm for millennia and across the entire universe to establish the most favorable conditions possible in case their descendants ever needed it. Arrakis was one of those planets, and when the time came that House Atreides was nearly destroyed and the young Paul and his mother were stranded and left for dead in the desert, they used the so-called Missionaria Protectiva to save themselves from their enemies and the fatal elements of Dune. With their entire lives destroyed and their only chance for survival lying in the hands of the Fremen, the choice was simple: either die or make their way to the Fremen siege. On the journey, Paul's prescience begins to grow, and he starts to foretell the future. He warns his mother that the Fremen will call him Muad'Dib, and he shall be the one that shows them the way. Upon reaching the siege, a combination of Jessica's expert exploitation of the Missionaria and Paul's mere presence there culminate in his complete acceptance into the Fremen following his victory over Jamis. "How do you call among you the little mouse, the mouse that jumps?" Paul asked. A chuckle sounded through the troop. With the power of prescience, Paul had started to perceive futures unnumbered. In those futures, a jihad would be unleashed upon the universe. Billions would die, civilizations lost, all in his name. Every moment that passed seemed to confirm the next, and he became increasingly anxious. He had seen the name Muad'Dib before Stilgar ever uttered it to him. He had heard millions shout it in reverence, yet he did not know all of its meanings. With every moment that passed, he attempted to do anything in his power to prevent the jihad he witnessed. Preventing his future name, he thought, was a good start, and when Stilgar asked him for his new Fremen name, Paul knew that he had to at least try to change the future. As such, he asked of the name of that little kangaroo mouse that roamed the desert, that he had seen in the nights before and which had intrigued him. This must be an opportunity. There is no way that little mouse would share a name with the genocide he witnessed in the future. "We call that one Muad'Dib," Stilgar said. Jessica gasped. It was the name Paul had told her, saying that the Fremen would accept them and call him thus. She felt a sudden fear of her son and for him. Little did Paul know that this small and powerless creature, so far away from the terror he led in his dreams, was Muad'Dib. He fell into the trap of prescience, and in his attempt to avoid a future he had calculated mathematically, he had brought that future just a step closer, trapped in a self-fulfilling prophecy that he desperately tried to escape with every action and every thought and in his every waking moment. Alas, that insignificant little creature he called forth turned out to bear the very name that would define him for the rest of his life, and because of that little desert mouse, the crowds will be crying for Muad'Dib. And again he remembered the vision of fanatic legions following the green and black banner of the Atreides, pillaging and burning across the universe in the name of their prophet Muad'Dib. That must not happen, he told himself. Paul was getting desperate, and at this point he started to realize that what he and his mother and their ancestors had set in motion may be impossible to stop. Being willing to try anything, however, regardless of how small, he attempted to change the future yet again. "Is that the name you wish, Muad'Dib?" Stilgar asked. "I am an Atreides," Paul whispered, and then louder, "It's not right that I give up entirely the name my father gave me. Could I be known among you as Paul Muad'Dib?" "You are Paul Muad'Dib," Stilgar said, and Paul thought, that was in no vision of mine. I did a different thing. A different thing indeed, but ultimately pointless. He would be called Paul Muad'Dib for a while and by a few, but the identity he took for himself as leader of the Fremen and as prophet overshadowed Paul Atreides and everything that remained of him. Not only that, but his ego started to grow and overtake him. He changed. He was no longer that little boy that had left Caladan. In fact, his new name, Muad'Dib, represented perfectly his new self. The outside appearance of the desert mouse may appear weak and insignificant, and Jamis had certainly made that mistake. The truth, however, is that Muad'Dib is the unseen master of the sands. The mouse is wise and knows the ways of Arrakis to perfection. It travels swiftly, knows precisely when to face the sun and when not to, and even uses its own sweat to create more water for itself. The mouse Muad'Dib represents the way of the Fremen, and as such, the new leader of the Fremen, their messiah, is Muad'Dib. Moreover, due to its wise attributes, Muad'Dib is also called the instructor of boys, the teacher, something that would be directly correlated to how the Fremen view Paul as the Lisan al-Gaib, the prophet that would come from the outer world, the voice of God that would bring them to water. This is why the siege is so impressed by Paul's decision, even though he chose the name by desperately trying to avoid it, and despite his best efforts to retain any sort of his personal identity, he was unable to. Muad'Dib became everything, because the Fremen became everything. And moving away from the lore itself, on a literary level, Frank Herbert chooses the name in order to signify Paul's change and transformation into the charismatic leader of the Fremen, who is utterly assimilated into the way of the desert and whose reputation grows to mystical and even mythical proportions. Where he starts as Paul and he becomes Paul Muad'Dib, in the constant battle between the two, it is Muad'Dib that is ultimately victorious. The evolution and nature of Paul's names serve as a reflection into his very soul and provide the reader the necessary context to understand the inner battle of Paul Atreides. Just a few days before his entry into the Fremen, he had called himself a freak and had terrified his mother with his visions. From being a freak, within a few weeks he embraces the role of the Messiah, at first in order to mitigate the harm done, but eventually, I think, for himself. He thinks he knows better. He thinks that it is his responsibility, Muad'Dib's responsibility, and not Paul's, to guide the universe to a fate he deems fit. His son, the God Emperor Leto II, would go on to do the same, despite what one might think of the results. Beyond that, Paul Atreides represents an earthly authority. He represents secularism, the son of a duke. A great duke, yes, but a duke nonetheless, and that type of authority has its limits. Muad'Dib, on the other hand, is something much higher, something spiritual, and whose authority comes from above. That type of authority is without question. As the readers, we know that Paul does not actually have that authority, however. He is simply the result of genetic engineering, and he is no prophet. Ultimately, what the young man had tried to avoid, the jihad, becomes Muad'Dib's jihad, and the name is used by Frank Herbert to showcase, even beyond the transformation, the folly of prescience, its corruption of Paul's innocence, and the danger Muad'Dib, and any Muad'Dib before or after, can pose to humanity. A massive thank you to my channel members, and thank you very much for watching.